Welcome to today's episode. I am so excited to introduce you to today's guest, who is Dr. Andrew Abela. He is the Dean of the Busch School of Business at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. And he just came out with a new book called Superhabits. And I probably shouldn't say this for the sake of other guests that I have interviewed this year, but um, please don't be offended, previous guests, but this may actually be the best book that I have read this year. Not because those other ones were not great, but because of how impactful this is and just how timely it is, not only in my life, but I think for our society as a whole, where for many of us, it can be very easy to get into this self-improvement, but we're receiving conflicting ideas as to what you should do in order to make your life better and to make others' lives better. But this book is very practical. Dr. Abela brings in uh, theology from St. Thomas Aquinas, as well as practical and interesting stories of people that you may know or may not know. But this was a delight to read, and I already started implementing some of his suggestions in the book, and I already just see some changes in my life, and it's only been a couple of days. So I think you all should read this book. But Dr. Avella, thank you for being here and welcome.
Thank you.
And I would just love to just hear what inspired you to write the book and what is the one thing that you want everyone to get out of it from reading it?
So the one thing is that whether you so the book is called Superhabits, and it's a term I came up with as another word for virtue, because people have a lot of wrong ideas of the word virtue. Either they like it, but they think it means exclusively morality. So to be virtuous is to be good, to be moral. Or they don't like it and they think that it's too kind of religious, and they're not interested. But it's neither of those things. So virtue is human excellence, right? And it's not just moral excellence, but excellence all told. And so that's why I came up with this new name, because a virtue is in fact a habit, a very good habit, that sort of gives you almost superpowers, hence super habits. But the one thing I would want people to take away is that if you're not trying to cultivate these virtues, these particular specific set of super habits, then life is more difficult for you than it needs to be. You are taking the harder road than you need to be taking, because we know this about we know this about habits, that when you make something a habit, it gets easier. If you're in the habit of making your bed every morning, it's not as much effort to make your bed. You just do it almost without thinking, without effort. You're not draining any of your willpower to do it because it's a habit. Well, likewise, if you can make a habit out of courage, out of justice, out of self-discipline, out of practical wisdom, which is wise decision making, then your whole life goes so much more smoothly. You do things better and with less effort, with less willpower. How cool is that, right?
It is. And so, again, for those who, I'll put a blurb about the book in the show notes, but just starting off the book, you start off with the first virtue, or the first super habit, which is resistance. And you tell this story that, like, as I'm reading it, my jaw is dropping of Dwayne the Rock. And can you just share that story? Like, because
Sure.
yeah, and how that connects with the virtue of restraint.
Restraint. Yeah, yeah. So the virtue of restraint is the habit of kind of being able to say no to impulses, to kind of trivial impulses that would get you to do something that you would regret later, to say something unkind or to buy something you don't need, just we all have these impulses. And this is a good virtue or a good super habit to start with, which is to learn to take those impulses and redirect them in a different place, a more constructive place. And so I wanted to tell a story of somebody who didn't have this super habit, but then cultivated it. So I told the story of this teenager whose nickname was Dewey. And Dewey was a very big kid, came from a difficult family situation, and was always getting into fights. And he was often shoplifting, because if he wanted something, typically couldn't afford things, he would steal. And if somebody annoyed him, he would fight them. And he was a big guy, so he hurt a lot of people, Um, but sometimes he got hurt when they ganged up on him. And he was often taken in by the police. And one time, his mom came to pick him up from the police station, and she was crying. And that night, he lay in bed thinking, I'm such an idiot. I need to just sort of stop doing this to my mom, making her suffer so much. And so he started to redirect these impulses he had to more constructive ways. Particularly, he started to play football in high school, and he started to wrestle. And he became actually quite good at both of those. There were some coaches who sort of paid good attention to him, but he learned this super habit of restraint. So when he felt like doing things, he didn't just give in to the impulse. He would sort of, okay, now if I'm going to have aggressive impulses, I'll just use them up on the football field. He actually got, after high school, he got a year in the NFL, although that didn't go any further. But then he took the wrestling and did really well, became a pro wrestler, very successful, and eventually went on to Hollywood. And he is, as you said, Dwayne the Rock Johnson. And that's his story. And it's a story of growing in this super habit of restraint. But that's just the beginning. That's the very first chapter, because the first 9 chapters of the book are all different super habits, different virtues related to a part of self-discipline, or what is classically called temperance. The virtue of temperance is the super habit of self-discipline, which is the habit of only following your desires when it makes sense to do so. So restraint is one of those. It's all about desires to do impulsive things. Humility is another, and that's actually the second chapter, and that's for impulses to do great things. We have desires to, end world hunger, for example. Humility is not kind of looking down on yourself. It's the super habit of having an accurate understanding of your abilities, so that while it's good to stretch yourself, humility stops you from doing things that are kind of where it's highly unlikely that you would be successful, and therefore you end up wasting a lot of your time, other people's time, wasting resources. So one of the early lessons of the book is that if you are trying to grow in self-discipline, so self-discipline or temperance is one of the cardinal virtues, one of the really big ones. It's tough to try to do it itself directly. So what you want to do is find one of what Aquinas calls the allied virtues. There are 15 of them that roll up to self-discipline. Find the one that would be most useful for you right now, whether it's restraint or humility. It could also be diligence, which is for the desire to know things. So it's directing your desire to know things to something productive. Find one of those, and you start with that instead. And then it helps you grow in self-discipline much more efficiently and effectively than if you try to kind of tackle self-discipline head on.
Yes, absolutely. And one thing I appreciated about the book was that for each of the virtues, at the end of the chapter, you provided suggestions on how we can begin to put them into practice. And one of them that I'm going to admit that I started doing was regarding restraint, which was you were saying that if you tend to speak colloquially and just say yeah or nope, and I realize I do that a lot, that you can consciously start training yourself to say yes or no. So I've been doing that, and it's been kind of a fun challenge to catch myself and say, oh, okay, no, this is how I'm choosing this week. And so I've already seen progress in myself, and I'm quite proud of myself.
I'm so glad to hear that. Each of the exercises that I shared, they're not ones I made up. They're all been empirically proven. So they come from research, and particularly the one about the yup or no, replacing that with yes or no. It's a great example of what makes a super habit rather than just a regular habit. And that is a super habit or a virtue different from so a regular habit makes things easier. You repeat it, becomes part of you, makes it easier. But a super habit goes one step further. It has a much wider scope. So if I'm in the habit of making my bed every morning, it's a good habit, and it makes making my bed every morning easier. But that's it. It doesn't help me with anything else. Whereas a super habit has much more scope. So as you develop the super habit of restraint by this sort of speech discipline, you will start to find that you are more restrained in other areas as well. So when somebody cuts you off on the highway, you'll be less likely to yell at them, for example. How does that happen? Because you're developing this muscle that we call restraint.
So, out of all of them, well, actually, before I jump to that question, can you explain a little bit for those who haven't yet read the book about the anatomy of the super habits that you describe and how they feed into, you mentioned a little bit about the anchor virtues. Can you just give us just a brief overview of how that works?
So I happen to have it here. There it is. Yay. So every copy of the book comes with a poster-sized version of the Anatomy of Virtue. And what it is a visual diagram of Thomas Aquinas's treatise on the virtues. So this is 750 years old. It's from the Summa Theologica of his. And what he does in that treatise, and it's 100 and some pages long, is he explains how all the virtues fit together. So I drew them as a circle to explain. You start out with sort of the human life right there in the center, and then each of the rings is a distinction that Aquinas makes. So the first ring, the golden ring there, is a distinction between spiritual life, which is its own faith, hope, and charity. Those are the virtues of the spiritual life. And then the sort of physical life or material life. And then the next ring divides material life into intellectual and practical. Oh, that's practical. So intellectual has its own virtues. And then practical is actually where it gets interesting. And that's where I focus most of the book. As the dean of a business school, like the practical life is sort of significance. And what he does is, so many people have heard of the four cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, right? But most people couldn't explain why those four. Like, what's so special about those four? Well, they're famous. Okay, yeah, but why? Aquinas explains this, and I've not seen this explained anywhere else. He says, so we have the theological virtues kind of for spiritual life. We have the intellectual virtues for our intellectual life. For our practical life, he says we can think of three dimensions of our practical life: our thoughts, our actions, and our feelings. Pretty complete, right? If you think about it, your everyday living, is there anything that occupies you other than thoughts, actions, feelings? That's pretty comprehensive. So, okay. Then he says, now let's take our feelings and make a further subdivision between feelings that attract us to things, those are our desires, and feelings that push us away from things, those that are fears. So we have thoughts, actions, fears, desires. Prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance. So prudence, or practical wisdom, the super habit of making wise decisions, is what manages all of our thinking. Because on a practical level, pretty much whenever we're thinking, it's to make some kind of decision. What shall I have for breakfast? What shall I say now? What shall I do now? Yeah. Our actions, so justice, the super habit of being fair to others and respecting their dignity. So all of our actions should then be governed by the super habit of justice so that we act justly. Fortitude or courage, the super habit of not being, of kind of experiencing fear but moving ahead anyway. Being courageous doesn't mean having no fear. That's not within our control. Fear comes and you can't do anything about it. What you can do anything about is, how do I react to that fear? And that's the super habit of courage, which anybody can acquire through practice. In the same way you stop saying yep or nope and you say yes and no, if you're trying to grow in courage, there are smaller super habits, but basically deciding when a certain thing happens, I'm going to take a step forward that I might not have done in the past, and then it just becomes easier. And then the last one, we were already talking about self-discipline or temperance, the super habit of only following your desires when it makes sense to do so. And so that's the next ring of distinction. And then each of those, so courage has four, what Aquinas calls allied virtues. Self-discipline, I've said, has 15. So if you want to grow in self-discipline, you figure out which of these 15 would be most helpful to my life right now. And the reason I draw this as a circle is to make Aquinas' point that this list is complete. So whatever issue you have in your life right now, whatever you're struggling with, there is a super habit, there is a virtue that will help you make it better, that will help it make it easier in your life. So if you struggle with anxiety, for example, there's the super habit of resilience, which is part of the virtue of courage, which is basically dealing with mental anguish, right? Mental suffering but learning to kind of endure that and keep going so that it becomes not as painful to you. And here's the beautiful thing, just with that one, in that example in particular, I was talking to a medical doctor who is actually an intern now at Mass General in psychiatry, and he was saying that treatment for anxiety and depression, the latest cutting edge treatment, is in effect what Aquinas is talking about for what I'm calling the virtue of resilience, which he wrote 750 years ago. So modern science is affirming the insights of this genius philosopher monk from 750 years ago.
That is incredible. And also, in a way, not surprising.
Right.
So, gosh, I have so many questions that so many different directions I want to go into, but I would love for you to touch a little bit about one particular virtue where you share about Flight 1549. Can you share a little bit the story? I'm sure those listening are very familiar with it, and just how that ties in with that virtue, and also why you chose that particular person and that particular story.
Sure. So, so in that chapter, the chapter is about the virtue, the super habit of practical wisdom. So practical wisdom, one of the cardinal virtues, or one of the big ones, and it's made up of 8. So it's right here. Practical wisdom is in purple, and there are 8 super habits that make it up. So it's the virtue, the super habit of making good decisions. And I wanted an example of somebody who was facing a really difficult situation, and faced it successfully. And then I wanted to see if I could tease out all 8 of those different virtues in action, all 8 of those super habits in action. So I looked at a number of situations, and when I saw the story of Captain Sullenberger, and I read his autobiography, I watched the movie with Tom Hanks, and I read also the accident report, which is a big fat thing, as you can imagine, tons and tons of details on the cause of the accident and so on. I thought this is exactly the story that I want to share, to make the point. Because the story is, as many will know, 2009, January 2009, plane is taking off from LaGuardia Airport to go to Charlotte, North Carolina, and hits an unusually large flock of birds that kind of 1,000,000 to 1 against chance blows out both of the engines of the plane. And the plane hadn't reached its full altitude yet. So it was roughly at most 3.5 minutes before the plane would hit the ground, crash, kill everybody inside, and probably thousands of others, because it's flying over Manhattan at this point, right? LaGuardia Airport, New York City. And so in the chapter, what I do is I go through almost second by second, what are the many decisions that Captain Sullenberger is making, and making successfully, ruling out options, exploring other options, and so on, to show how each of the 8 super habits came into play. So the first 4 super habits are all about gathering the information you need. The first one is memory. That's some surprise people. Is memory a habit? We don't know if it's technically a habit, but it certainly acts like one, because the more you practice your memory, the better it gets. And so he's recalling. So what I do is, as I'm going through the minute by minute, second by second chronology, I also do flashbacks to earlier in his life to show how he was practicing these things early on. So there's memory. Then there's the virtue of teachability, sometimes called docility, which is the habit of learning well from others, making yourself a good student. And he did that in spades. He was a very, very highly experienced, very senior pilot by the time of 2009, flight 1549. But all along, he was always trying to learn more, In particular, he had become a student of plane accidents. So he had read previous accident reports to try to educate himself and say, well, what went wrong? Sadly, most accident reports, the data is from the black box, because everybody dies, right? When there's something wrong with the plane, oftentimes it ends really badly. And so he had all of that knowledge because he had been so teachable. Then there are 2 others, which is gaining sort of new information. One is the super habit of judgment, which is choosing the right set of principles. So I talk about that. And then the last one is creativity. And so it shows how he's being creative as he's like, where are we going to land? We could land on a runway, but none of the runways are within reach. So he considers all those. We could land on a highway, but all of the highways nearby have bridges, so that doesn't work. Open fields, there aren't any in Manhattan. Even Central Park has all kinds of bumps and hills. Water, okay, fine. There's water just by LaGuardia Airport, but there's not very many recovery resources there. Whereas where he landed the plane, he's surrounded by. That's why the recovery effort happened so quickly, because so all of these kind of things going through his head. And then the fifth one is about reasoning, so it's just kind of the logicking through. And then the last three are about how do you translate your decision into action. So there's one about situational awareness, one is about anticipating possible problems, and then the last one about constantly sensing the environment to see what's changing. And so the story of how he can hit the birds, and then he's just going through. And so as I go through, each time I flash back to some other event in his life where he learned or he grew in one of those super habits, and then the whole thing flows really nicely. And you at the end of the chapter, it's like, I really understand now what practical wisdom is. And just as a nice coda, 2 weeks ago, I had the pleasure of interviewing one of the passengers from the flight. I met him completely randomly, providentially, on LinkedIn. I wasn't looking for him. He wasn't looking for me. And so I asked him if I could interview him. So I did on Zoom, just a 10-minute interview. It was hard for him to go through it, but it's now 16 years. First, I sent him the chapter and I said, did I make any mistakes? Because it was all done from secondary materials. I hadn't interviewed anyone before. So it was really nice. He read through it and he said, no, you said you got it right. So that was good. And then he just told his own perspective on what that was like, and how he sort of made peace with a baby ready to die. And then the most beautiful thing, I asked him, what's the lasting impact, if any? And he said, 16 years later, to this day, he still lives every moment absorbing everything good from every moment, thinking I could have died that day and I'm still here, So it's a beautiful. I can give you the link for your show notes if you like, if
Yes,
anybody wants to watch it.
please.
Yeah.
Yes, that is incredible. Oh my goodness. Yes, it was really riveting reading through everything. And I love the way you laid it out and with the flashbacks, because it really helped me as a reader to see that at least that in that moment of courage, I know that wasn't the specific virtue, but it was years in the making, where
Yes.
oftentimes I tend to think like, oh, somebody made a decision once and it was just because they were courageous in that moment or they had the practical wisdom in that moment. But it's over years of practice and developing that. So I really appreciated you doing that. So actually with that, there was a line in the book where you share that I'm gonna just read because it you mentioned that that the pilot, that after this all happened, that people would randomly come up to him and just be in tears and
I was
they
just thinking of
couldn't
that. Yeah.
articulate that. And as I'm like reading this account towards the end, like tears came to my eyes and I'm like, this is strange. Why am I crying? But I really like what you said, so I'm just going to go ahead and read it. So it's on page 162 where you say, what does flight 1549 represent? Here's what I think. It is the coming together of competence and decency, of true human excellence. Human excellence means not just being supremely competent, being really good at what you do. It also means using that competence in the service of others. And so I think if I can just say that with all of these super habits, all of these virtues, when we cultivate them, they not only make our lives better or easier or more enhanced, I would also posit that they make other people's lives better because we're bringing our best selves to the table. And in a sense, it draws them to bring their best self. And it just, the more we treat people with friendliness, which was another virtue that I was surprised by, then just the world is better. So I really appreciated that statement.
Well, the whole book is kind of hopefully a very easy to read and fun to read, but a manual for human excellence, for being human at its very best, which means that you enjoy your life the most and others enjoy you the most when we are this way. And the beauty of it is so I was on EWTN just this morning. I was, if you can see a trace of makeup, that's why I just came from the studio. And we were talking about this, that the if you live this way, life gets easier and better for yourself and better for those around you. And so if you don't live this way, implicitly, you're just taking a harder road unnecessarily. Unnecessarily. You're making life more difficult for yourself than it needs to be. But if you cultivate these specific habits, life gets easier, you get happier. In most cases, you get healthier, as you saw from the research in the book, and you're more effective at what you do, and it's good for those around you. It's like, what else do I have to say? It's like, this is just really good stuff. And it's not a coincidence, right? I didn't just discover this under a rock. I'm not some kind of genius that say, hey, I found this new way. This is the accumulation of thousands of years of the best philosophers, right? And then the best of modern science put together. It's like, yeah, this is really good stuff. Yeah.
Exactly. So, if you don't mind answering this, which of these particular super habits are you currently working on?
Yes. So have been working for a while on the virtue of alertness, which is one of those final three for decision making. So it is the super habit of having situational awareness. I am one of those people who can really be hyper focused. One of my my first job out of college was at Procter and Gamble in marketing, and we had desks that were all out in the open, and so there was all kinds of noise and phones and stuff. And I learned to just kind of lock down, focus, and ignore everything. And then when we had young children in the home, I could be working at home and ignore everything. And my wife would say, "Can't you tell the baby's crying?" Okay, I was like, "Sorry, I just." And so that had become that's not a super habit. That's just a habit. And so it has bad tendencies, which is I tend to tune other stuff out. So I've been trying to grow and the reason I'm doing that, you may have noticed this, there's a QR code towards the back of the book, which gives people a free app. And the app then gives you a diagnostic tool so you can see which, and alertness is way at the bottom for me. But not only does it do that, then you can click on it, it will tell you more about that particular super habit. And then there's an AI coach that will text you. Like, you can work with the coach to identify what's the practice you want to choose every day, and then we'll send you a text every morning saying, don't forget to practice this. At the end of the day, it'll text you again, so did you do it? And it'll keep track of your streaks for you. So it's a good way. And then if you didn't do it, you can have a conversation with the app and the app will say, well, what did you find hard about that? Or how about you try it this way instead? So you kind of, it fine tunes it just for you. So then you have the thing you practice every day. And then after a couple of weeks, you can retake the test and see kind of where you're improved, because you made the point, Sullenberger, the chapter is about practical wisdom, decisions, but there's also a whole host of courage involved there, because the virtues are all interconnected. So as you grow in one virtue, one super habit, it's not surprising to see that you're also growing in others as well. So
Wonderful. So, I would love to hear, how have your students received this knowledge, I would say, yes. And then what recommendations would you have for parents in training their children on these virtues? The last one is a selfish question.
what a lot of people, including students, I think really appreciate is just to be able to see the big picture, the whole vision of it. And so as parents, we can look at that and go, okay, this is, I sometimes call this the human operating system. It's kind of like, just like on your phone or your laptop, if you don't update your operating system, the apps kind of slow down. And at the same with the super habits or the virtues, if you're not constantly growing in them, improving them, then all the skills you have and ambitions and so on, just like apps, aren't going to run as well because you don't have this foundation. So as parents, knowing what the foundation is, knowing what the key super habits are, you can then sort of diagnose with your children where do they need to grow and give them occasions to practice. And the key thing is the practice. It doesn't matter if you reward them. Some people are afraid of that. Oh, if you give them a reward, you'll take away the virtue. No, no, no. Just give them the practice. Virtues, super habits are kind of psychic muscles, psychological muscles, spiritual muscles, that we all have. We just need to exercise them. I was meeting with students yesterday. We had an event around the book, and the example I gave them was, if you ever been in some kind of a new sport and you say, oh my, afterwards, like muscles I didn't even know are hurting me. Well, the super habits are muscles you didn't even know you had. But sometimes you feel like you don't have them because they haven't been exercised. But once you start to exercise them, they get stronger, just like physically kind of working out your muscles. And so you even if you give a child a reward to exercise that muscle is still growing. So you're not taking anything away with the reward. And what you'll find after a while, they will do it anyway, even without the reward, because virtue is a beautiful thing, and we come to love it as we grow in it.
Mhm. Yes. And honestly, I think it's just like your students. I'm so grateful to have just very concrete, like I'm a very practical person, so I appreciate just concrete pillars to to hold on to that. Like my husband and I talk about how we want to raise our son and future children, but it's nice to have like even more things to hold on to just say, okay, in this specific way, this is what we're going to be leading and guiding them through. So so thank you for writing this book.
My pleasure.
So as we wrap up here, is there anything that I didn't ask you that you're like, oh, I really wanted to talk about this?
The thing I would emphasize, and we did touch on this, but the thing I want to emphasize, there's a phrase I use in the book a couple of times: beginning is winning. Um, to know that every one of us has potentially all of these super habits, and the secret to a happy and flourishing life is growth in all these super habits. And anyone can grow in any one of them. So the way to use the book is start from the beginning. And as soon as you get to a super habit where you say, if I could do this instinctively, automatically, my life would be so much better. If I could deal with anxiety without any concern, my life would be so much better. If I could learn much better, and easier, my life would be so much better. Whatever the thing is that you think would make your life better, that's the super habit, that's the virtue to focus on. Find the small step that you can take now, and you take it each day until that small step becomes automatic. Then you can pick another step until that becomes automatic. And they become part of you, so you're not using willpower to do them, and then that part of your life becomes much easier. So let's say you're very shy and you want to get better at making friends. There is this specific virtue, right? This specific super habit of friendliness or friendship. There are little steps you can take. For example, just smiling at strangers, is a really good step. The research shows that merely doing that makes you feel happier anyway. So that's why I say beginning is winning. Even the tiny step is usually going to give some kind of, in psychological terms, or some kind of dopamine reinforcement, so you're more likely to do it again and again, becomes part of you. So my big message is kind of find the super habit, the virtue that's going to really change your life, and then take the tiniest step. And the app can help you with that. Take the tiniest step and just keep doing that repeatedly, and you're already on the path to a much improved life.
Wonderful. Well, you all heard it. Just beginning is winning. So thank you all for listening, and thank you, Dr. Abela, for your time and for sharing this accumulated wisdom with us. And I just again highly encourage you all to just get the perk book and then download the app. I'm actually going to download the app after this conversation. And yes, this has been so great. So thank you again, Dr. Abela.
My pleasure.
All right. And God bless you all. And remember, when you say yes to God, you change the world. See you next time.